All my life, I've been a man of peace. Working for peace, striving for peace, negotiating for peace. I've been a League of Nations man and a United Nations man. And I'm still the same man, with the same convictions, the same devotion to peace. I couldn't be other, even if I wished. But I'm utterly convinced that the action we have taken is right.
Napoleon once said Egypt is the most important country in the world. And I think he was right. It is the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. It's the bridge. And it became, of course, more important with the building of the Suez Canal.
So the Suez Canal is the cause, you might say, it's the cause of the humiliation we had by British occupation of Egypt for more than 70 years.
For the British Empire, Egypt was more than pyramids and sphinxes. It was the Suez Canal, the lifeline of the empire. In the Canal Zone, Britain maintained the world's largest overseas military base to deal with any threat to the empire's trade and stability. The vast bulk of Britain's possessions lay beyond Suez. Although Egypt was nominally independent, British control was overwhelming and in 1936 was legalized by a treaty. The Egyptians could do nothing but smile.
Mr. Anthony Eden presided when the Anglo-Egyptian Pact was signed.
Of their common interests and the symbol of a freely agreed and enduring partnership between the British and Egyptian people.
For Egypt, the treaty was signed by the Premier, Nahas Pasha. For Britain, by Mr. Eden, the Foreign Secretary. Outside the Foreign Office, Nahas Pasha made a short speech for the GB camera.
I'm very happy to sign the treaty. Treaty of friendship and alliance between the two peoples. Friends, England and Egypt.
The friendship was unequal. The British ambassador continued to lord it over Cairo, driving home to the Egyptians their servile position. He habitually referred to Farouk, the king of Egypt, as the boy, and even imposed on him Britain's choice of prime minister. During the Second World War, Cairo became the military nerve center of the British Empire. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his number two, Anthony Eden, came here repeatedly to oversee campaigns in Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe. In the 1936 treaty, Britain had undertaken to reduce the number of its troops in Egypt. After the war, it failed to carry out that promise, provoking Egyptian nationalists to guerrilla warfare. By 1950, the 80,000 troops, as they tried to suppress the challenge, found themselves facing grenades, kidnapping, and sabotage. British families had to be evacuated.
Well, we were supposed to be guarding the most strategic part of the world. This is what we were always told, that we were on active service. But the sporadic activities of the Egyptian guerrillas effectively tied us up in our own camp. And they were effective insofar as that they almost made us prisoners within our own camp.
كل واحد بيقدر يعمل أي حاجة بيعملها. ممكن يعني حتى الأطفال يعني اللي ما عرفش يعمل حاجة هو بيضرب بالطوب. فكان لما تمر اي عربيه من الجيش البريطاني بتبقى في خطر من كل ناحيه، ويعني اللي كان العربيه اللي تنزل كانت مضطره اضطرار شديد جدا، فكانوا بيلاقوا مضايقات كتير، لان كان يهمنا ان الناس دول يمشوا باي طريقه.
Britain kept up its troop numbers, if only to guard its military airfields, railways and supply depots. The Egyptian government accused the British of breaking the treaty, and in October 1951 tore it up. The man responsible had himself signed the treaty 15 years before, Nahas Pasha.
The parliament was so 3 minutes at least standing, applauding Nahas Pasha. All over Egypt, from Aswan to Alexandria, demonstrations, and from all people, fellahin, laborers, everybody in Egypt was so happy.
Anti-British posters are swept along on a rising tide of nationalism as Egyptians of all classes heap abuse upon the country that defended their frontiers in World War II.
The Egyptian government secretly backed the guerrillas on the Canal Zone. 2 of King Farouk's senior ministers explain why.
In order to prove to the United Kingdoms, to the leaders of Great Britain, that the base is useless, as we explained to them in the negotiations. The base is useless, and we denied to them all privileges delivered to them by the treaty. And we made a law that prevents any Egyptian to deal with the British. And made the punishment. It reaches to capital punishment, to give them any ammunition, any stocks, any dealing with the British. It was prohibited.
حتى كان عندي 130 عجل موجودين في كارانتين البورسعيد، سبتهم عشان امون الاهالي، اديهم للناس، مش قد الجيش البريطاني. يعني كنا عاوزين يعني نعمل له مضايقات بكل الاسباب، كل السبل.
So I was decided with some of my friends who was been treating me that we must fight all the British troops which at Egypt, for these troops whom were help the Europeans to treat us as animals and insects and something like that.
With the winter of 1951 came escalating violence throughout the Canal Zone. The Egyptian police recruited and armed part-time guerrillas who attacked British troops. The British responded with increasingly severe search and destroy tactics. By January 1952, the British had had enough. Troops cordoned off the town of Ismailia and surrounded the police headquarters.
This was the scene in Ismailia after British troops had waited while orders were broadcast to Egyptian police to leave their headquarters and surrender.
After 1 hour, or more or less, I had some casualties in the area. And the switchboard man asked me that the Minister of Interior on the telephone, he wants to speak to the officer in charge, who was me. And I spoke with him. He said, what's going on? So I hold the telephone, and he heard the shooting of the British troops.
Interior Minister Seragadin took his opportunity. If British commanding officer Brigadier Exham wanted a showdown, so did he.
He said, well, what are you going to do? I said, we already have our own decision. And he asked me what it is. I said, we are going not to surrender to the terms of Brigadier Exham. And we are not going to leave this place, even if we all die. And I told Brigadier Exham that I know he will enter this place, but only he will receive dead bodies. So the minister said, all right, God will be with you, and the line was cut after that. Every minute we got casualties. I mean, lost his arm, lost his leg, severe ones.
To save heavy British losses, which would result in storming this armed fortress, Centurion tanks blast their way into the target. After the softening up process came a determined charge as the Fusiliers burst into the now ruined building.
I was surprised at the carnage. It was quite awful, really. I think there was about 50 Egyptians killed. There was quite a few wounded, and quite seriously wounded, some of them.
By early evening, the British had a change of heart. To continue would do more harm than good. The Egyptian police chief had the same idea.
I decided to put an end for that, believe me. So I decided to go out. Either I killed Exham or he killed me. Because it was, if you, Hitchcock himself can do this terrifying atmosphere. So when I went out, I was shocked by seeing a general, a full general, General Matthews. It was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And before I went to Exham, because he was my aim, he saluted me. And I was astonished. A general, a full general saluted a captain. So I stopped and I saluted him. And he spoke with me very nicely and very encouraging. And he said, anything you want, all your terms, I am ready to accept it.
By the time of the surrender, at least 50 policemen had been killed at the Ismailia police barracks, also known as the governorate.
When Colonel Mallet entered the governorate, after this event was finished, about 7 o'clock in the afternoon, he put his hands on his eyes and he said, what a rotten job we have done.
The next day, crowds in Cairo took their revenge on foreigners. Many were killed as the Turf Club, Shepherd's Hotel, and some 400 other buildings were burned in what became known as Black Saturday. But Anthony Eden kept a cool head.
He decided that the troops should not be moved from Ismailia, which we were quite capable of doing, and that Farouk must be left to deal with the situation which he had largely created by arousing the fury of the Cairo mob against Britain.
King Farouk and his government were failing to drive out the British. Others thought they could do better.
From Cairo come these first authentic pictures of the bloodless coup by which the army took over control of Egypt. It was the end of the king's attempt to maintain power. To the ordinary Egyptian, the change is welcome, and it seems that Mohammed Naguib is assured of support at home. What the change will mean to the rest of the world, we have yet to see.
General Naguib was a figurehead. Soon, a younger and more forceful officer was calling the tune, Colonel Gamal Abdul Nasser. He and his colleagues took up the task of expelling the British with renewed vigor. They sought an ally in the traditionally anti-imperialist Americans, who were taking a growing interest in the Middle East.
The Americans in that period were very active, and they were also interested because they were also interested in the pacts, in the mutual security pacts. So they were coming out with formulas. I remember that practically all the formulas which were given to us by the British later on were previously given to us by the Americans, and the Americans played the role of, they were the sounding power, if you want to say so. They modified some things with us. They appeared to us as if they are playing the role of an honest broker.
In the Cold War, American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was looking for allies to join Western pacts against the Russians. When he visited Cairo in May 1953, the Egyptians asked for arms for their own use. Dulles refused, but for one small exception.
We just opened our first meeting and the press was all there, of course, taking pictures of the gathering, and then that phase was finished and they all went out and the door was closed. And Dulles reached behind his back and pulled out a box and handed Naguib a pistol. And all hell broke loose, really. You see, it was an insignificant thing, but it looked like a symbol. It looked like we were offering to back Naguib against his adversaries, which included, of course, the British. It didn't make us very popular in London.
During the course of their talk, Secretary Dulles, while seeking the safeguarding of the Suez Canal, agrees that a withdrawal of foreign troops should be effected as soon as Suez guarantees can be made.
The U.S. both sort of urged or pressed the British to try to be forthcoming to make a deal, and also offered, as I recall it, the Egyptians various, I think some economic and military aid if a settlement could be reached.
It was only natural that using one side against the other, we could get better out of it. And that is why we had very close contacts with the Americans to influence the going on of the negotiations that were going on at that time between us and Great Britain to evacuate the British forces.
كان الغزاة الأجانب يحتلون أرض مصر، يحتلون القواعد المدججة بالسلاح، ترهب الوطن المصري وتحطم مقاومته.
By 1954, Britain's Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden had concluded that the Suez base was more trouble than it was worth. But his view was rejected by a noisy backbench movement within his own party, the Suez Group, and by his Prime Minister.
Churchill was the man who said that he had not become the Queen's First Minister, or the King's First Minister in those days, to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. And he realized the crucial importance of the Suez zone, the Canal zone. This was the strong point for the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, linking the Commonwealth as a defense unit. And he was therefore very much against the proposed withdrawal. On the other hand, he was 80. Eden, who was his crown prince, was for it. The Americans were for it. Of course, the Russians were for it. So he was in a difficult position.
In fact, he was eventually reasoned out of this attitude, largely by the Chiefs of Staff and also by Anthony Eden himself, who felt that we had to redeploy our forces, that to keep troops in the Canal zone was a nonsense in modern terms, because instead of defending the Canal zone against some potential aggressor, Russia or whoever might invade the Middle East and try and take the canal, the British garrison there, which was some 80,000 strong, was in fact defending itself against a hostile population, and therefore was really performing no useful military role whatsoever.
In September 1954, Anthony Nutting and President Nasser signed the agreement under which Britain at last consented to withdraw its troops, a task that would take 20 months.
After I'd signed the agreement, Anthony Eden sent me a telegram saying, don't come home immediately. You've had your head in details of negotiations, both you and Nasser, for the last 2 months. Go off and find out what makes the man tick. Talk to him and find out how he sees the future. And I came back with this report saying I thought that he was a man of considerable charisma. He was a great patriot, determined to remain neutral as between the power blocks in the world, but equally prepared and anxious to have good relations with Britain and to open this new chapter on a friendly note. And Anthony Eden seemed to share this hope. at that time. But then, of course, the situation changed.
Egypt celebrated the beginning of the British troop withdrawal, seen by Nasser as the removal of imperialism from the Middle East. At the same time, the British put forward a new scheme to maintain their whip hand in the area, the Baghdad Pact. Britain's friends and allies, Turkey and Iraq, welcomed the security of British backing and joined the pact in February 1955. In the same month, Britain tried to persuade Egypt to join. The British embassy in Cairo had often been the place where Egypt's future was decided. Now Anthony Eden came here with an entourage of Britain's top diplomats and soldiers and invited President Nasser to dinner. It was to be their only meeting, a meeting between two worlds.
At the beginning, you know, there was some social talk when Mr. Eden, before dinner, when Mr. Eden was talking, as a matter of fact, about him being an expert on Egyptian affairs. When President Nasser, as a matter of fact, did not utter a word at that part. It was Eden, the star of Western diplomacy, talking about the role he played in the signing of the treaty of 1936. And he even greeted President Nasser when he entered in Arabic, and Nasser was astonished.
For some reason or other, Anthony Eden tried to upstage him, and Nasser resented this and clearly showed his resentment. And from then on, the two men really, I think, rather disliked one another. And this, of course, did not help to produce this friendly relationship that I thought I'd laid the foundations of only a few weeks before.
It was in their interest, just as much as in ours, we thought that they should join the Baghdad Pact. And after I'd finished describing this sort of general strategic concept, and he asked Nasser if he'd like to comment on what I'd had to say, and Nasser said, well, I agree completely. Well, that rather flummoxed me, because we then went on, and Anthony Eden tried for the best part of an hour to convince Nasser, well, what I would have thought was the logical conclusion of that they should join the Baghdad Pact. But no, for a solid hour.
It was not only Nasser's idea, but it was a national question. I mean, that we are refusing to join any pact because we believe that if you want the colonial power to leave the door, they shouldn't come from the window. So that's why we are refusing the idea, and we were reluctant to accept the idea that the Russians are the main threat to us. We in all our history, we never felt that the Russians are really a threat to Egypt or to the Middle East. They never attacked us, never in all our history. But we were repeating that the main danger was the existing of the policy of Israel.
Within days of Eden's meeting with Nasser, Israel countered Egyptian-backed border raids with a full-scale attack on Egyptian troops at Gaza. Nasser decided he must at once buy new armaments. Britain and America turned him down. So Nasser was driven to a rival source, the Soviet Union.
Nasser was living at that time in the Revolutionary Council building. So was many of the Revolutionary Council members. And we were spending days and nights discussing the political, aspect of the question, whether if we take such a step. We knew how antagonized the Western countries and America would be. But at the end of the discussions, we found out that we had no other alternative except to go for the Soviet Union.
I would say that when we started having some feelers about the possibility of having arms from the Soviet Union, there was this idea vague in the air that maybe if the Americans got wind of what was happening, they will come with the arms. This did not happen. And I remember that even after the Russians gave their first okay, that Nasser said to BYROADE, the American ambassador, I have a Russian offer here in my desk. And it is for the first time that I am asking for American arms. And there was no answer. And they thought he was bluffing.
On the question of arms, I never got an answer from Washington that I could pass on to Nasser. I was never told why, but it was perfectly obvious to me that the supporters of Israel is a very strong political force in American domestic politics. And I think there was a reluctance in Washington to take on that criticism in arms to Egypt.
Encouraged by the leaders of the non-aligned nations, Nasser concluded his deal to buy Russian arms in September 1955. To Dulles, this was an act of aggression. More offensive to Eden was Nasser's propaganda radio station, the Voice of the Arabs, beamed all over the Middle East. Its appeals to Britain's Arab allies to throw off their shackles disrupted Eden's carefully laid plans.
The Voice of the Arabs and Nasser's positions at that time created a tidal wave of Arab nationalism in the area. And the British were unable to understand that this was the normal reaction of a suppressed revolution, evolution in the making. And they considered it all plotting by Nasser and, a grand design.
The Voice of the Arabs first hit home against the British here in Amman, the capital of nearby Jordan, provoking a crisis that would lead Anthony Eden into a whirlpool of misjudgments over Egypt. Britain was still the dominant power in Jordan, and the young king, Hussein, had been ready to join the Baghdad Pact. But so strong was the opposition of Jordanian nationalists, encouraged by Nasser's propaganda, that the king backed down. Some Jordanians thought that the British, furious at the king's retreat, might go so far as to remove him.
Well, you see, the British thought this Baghdad Pact was so vital for Western interests, for British interests, especially in this area, which is very important, as we know all. And they thought that by mobilizing all the states in this area to join the Baghdad Pact, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, they will form a formidable strength in the face of any Russian advance. For that purpose, the monarch of Jordan was really not somebody whom they would weigh against such an important goal they were looking at, aiming at. They were going to sacrifice the king so that Jordan will join the Baghdad Pact under the name of unity with Iraq.
Jordan's army, the crack troops of the Arab world, were maintained by Britain. Now, some young officers aimed to be rid of the British, and particularly of their British commander-in-chief, Sir John Glubb, known as Glubb Pasha. For Eden, Glubb was a trusted man in a key position. King Hussein, whose grandfather had been given his throne by the British, was caught between Britain and his own nationalists. At this difficult moment, Glubb proposed to dismiss certain young officers. The king was told that the British were also planning to get rid of him.
The situation was not a very, very pleasant one here at all, in point of fact. I think that it was very close to the boil. People still looked at me as a person they cared for. I was my grandfather's grandson, and his choice to take over his position. The Baghdad crisis, as far as Jordan was concerned, was just over. The area was in turmoil. The country was under many pressures, and it was a state of agitation. But more than that, just probably a couple of days before, we had received a list of dismissals of some Jordanian officers, and I really felt that that was the end of it. I couldn't sign it and destroy the chances of some officers whom might have been able to serve their country.
The king called me from his cousin's house, and he said, "Can you do it tomorrow?" He meant, can you effect your operation tomorrow? I said to him, even now, I am ready. So he said, all right, I'm coming to see you. He came to the palace, and we met in my office. And we decided that 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, everything will be done to take control of the army, to put in custody all the British officers in all the units, fighting units. And only one man not to be touched, to give him as far liberty as possible, not more. That was GLUBB, because he was the head.
Well, I was in my office one morning and I got a telephone message asking me to come down to the Prime Minister's office. I walked into his office and sat down. There was nobody there. He came in a minute or two later. Of course, I'd known him for 25 years or so.
Yeah.
And he said, really, it's very painful for me, but I've got to tell you that the King says that he thinks it's time you had a rest. And he said, well, we'd like you to leave in 2 hours.
2 hours after 26 years. Why should they give you such a fantastically short time limit as that?
Well, I think some of the advisors had told the King that I should probably refuse to go and call out the army and try to make a revolution or something like this.
Could you, in fact, if you wanted to, have called the Arab Legion out against the King and deposed him and taken over and everything else?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as that, but one could have made a lot of trouble, of course, but it's just the kind of thing you don't do. I spent all my life serving them.
Whatever plans GLUBB may have had been preempted. Many in the Conservative Party demanded a Churchillian smack of firm government. But Eden, not Churchill, was now Prime Minister and had to deal with GLUBB's dismissal.
This came, of course, as a body blow to Eden's pride and vanity. And his reaction was violent, and he looked around for a scapegoat, and the scapegoat was Nasser, because Nasser was obviously delighted that General GLUBB should have been removed. But Nasser had not been behind it. Nasser had not ordered the dismissal of GLUBB, but and Eden was convinced that he had.
No truth whatsoever. Nasser had no idea what was happening here, or certainly didn't know of our decision. And I think it was as much a surprise to Nasser as it was to the world as a whole.
Misunderstandings increased. On the day of GLUBB's dismissal, the new Foreign Secretary, Selwyn Lloyd, happened to be in Cairo visiting Nasser.
Nasser was really surprised that it happened, but he, at the beginning, he thought that the British did it and timed it with Selwyn Lloyd's visit to Cairo as a sign of goodwill towards the Arabs. So it was a misunderstanding, obviously, which led to, after that, to so many complications.
I was horrified to get a telephone call over an open line to the Savoy Hotel in which Anne Eden said, "What's all this poppycock you've sent me about isolating and quarantining Nasser? Can't you understand, and if you can't understand it, will you come to the cabinet and explain why, that I want Nasser," and he actually used the word murdered.
Eden was by now convinced Nasser was out to destroy any remaining influence Britain had in the Middle East. He declared a personal war on the Egyptian leader. Eden knew what the Nile meant to Egypt. He had been the driving force behind an Anglo-American offer to build a dam across the Nile at Aswan. It was to be the biggest dam in the world, and for Nasser, symbolized his promise to regenerate Egypt. Eden now determined to stop the project. Dulles had his own reasons for agreeing and cancelled the dam loan. Nasser's survival in power was at stake. He had to produce a stunning response.
On July 26th, Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. At Alexandria, an inflamed and engulfing crowd heard President Nasser say, "At this moment, some of your brothers are now taking over the Suez Canal. The canal," he said, "is the property of Egypt. 120,000 Egyptian workers died digging the canal. We will build the high dam."
The nationalization surprised the British and French, who for 70 years had run the canal despite growing Egyptian resentment. Nasser knew, though, he had not only the Egyptians, but the law on his side.
Well, we were studying that for more than 2 years, but not nationalization. We tried to study the history, our rights, and the rights of the Suez Canal Company. the rights of the users. But after the withdrawal of the high dam loans and aids, we thought that we must nationalize the Suez Canal Company. They used to take 16 million pounds to be distributed every year, and we thought that the Egyptian people can use these 16 million pounds for the development of their projects.
I told him I thought he had missed, his staff had missed the point completely. They had judged the French and British reaction mostly because of financial loss in shares of the Suez Canal Company. And I said I didn't think that was the answer at all. It was bound to be a very emotional issue.
Plainly, a great issue had arisen. I thought, and my friends thought, that the withdrawal from the Canal Zone had been potentially fatal to the unity of the Commonwealth. Was there now an opportunity to retrieve it? I was convinced there was, and that if we pressed an attack against Egypt, political if possible, but military if necessary, we could recover the ground that had been lost.
Our quarrel is not with Egypt, still less with the Arab world. It is with Colonel Nasser. We all know this is how fascist governments behave. And we all remember, only too well, what the cost can be in giving in to fascism. We cannot agree that an act of plunder, which threatens the livelihood of many nations, should be allowed to succeed.
I think he was secretly rather delighted, because this gave him the pretext to marshal his forces, literally military forces, to destroy this man on whom he had declared his personal war at the time of the dismissal of GLUBB. Which pretext up till then he had lacked, because Nasser had done nothing to offend, done nothing to give Eden any possibility or excuse for taking direct action of any kind against Nasser.
Has there ever been a time during this crisis when you thought the British and French might actually use force?
Well, of course, because of these threats of use of force, concentrations, and movement of troops, I thought that any time I'll be facing an act of aggression. Until now, I'm still thinking. No, I think it is a matter of prestige. I think they are sure that we will not close the canal or raise the tolls. Because if we close the canal, we'll be in trouble. Suppose we close the canal against Britain, what will be the result? Britain will have the cause to defend her interests, to defend her economy, and then they will be able to have an aggressive action against Egypt. I don't think at all that we will be in a position to be in war with Britain. And I think British are sure that we will not have any discrimination against them, against their lifeline, as they said, against their economy. But really it is a matter of prestige.
His estimation was that if the British did not interfere directly in the first 2 weeks, then every week after that the possibility of military intervention will diminish. So the most important thing was A, to know what is the state of preparedness now, B, to know what are the possibilities of political maneuver so that we can gain time. And his estimate was, if they don't have enough power to interfere now, then all our policy should be directed to gaining time as much as we can.
Meanwhile, the Egyptians kept the canal working efficiently and piloted through more ships than ever. Nasser was careful not to give Eden the pretext for the military action he wanted. Equally determined to avoid war were the American President, Eisenhower, and his Secretary of State, Dulles.
During the summer, Dulles essentially invented a series of actions or steps, like the London meeting, like the Users Association, like the meeting at the UN, all of which were designed to try to keep the negotiating process going and to keep things from coming to a head, which would give the British a pretext for using force. And I think that Eden became aware of what was happening, and he became resentful because he felt that In a sense, Dulles was outsmarting him, that he thought he would get Dulles into a corner in which he would be able to say to Dulles and to Eisenhower, you see, we've exhausted all the other possibilities. There's nothing to do but to resort to force. And every time he tried to do that, he'd think he was having him in a corner, and Dulles would come out through a new trap door and avoid getting trapped.
The world was indeed happy to share the gratification of President Eisenhower yesterday when he opened his televised conference by saying, I have an announcement. I have got the best announcement that I could possibly make to America tonight.
After 3 months of negotiations, a formula for agreement was worked out, the 6 principles. At last, a solution to the satisfaction of all looked likely.
Most gratifying. Egypt, Britain, and France have met through their foreign ministers and agreed on a set of principles on which to negotiate, and it looks like here is a very great crisis that is behind us.
And we thought that we were gaining time and that we were diffusing the crisis. The 6 points in the Security Council, I remember that when we returned back, the message from Hammarskjöld, the message from the Indians, when I returned back from the meetings of the Security Council around the 15th of October, President Nasser was completely under the impression that the crisis is over.
So far as Eden was concerned, he didn't want a negotiated settlement. He wanted to topple Nasser. And I think almost Eden's worst moment in the whole of the Suez crisis was when Selwyn Lloyd, Christian Pinault, the French foreign minister, and Mahmoud Fawzi, the Egyptian foreign minister, reached an agreement on the Suez Canal question in New York, behind the scenes at the United Nations, towards the end of October of 1956.
Eden seemed to have lost his chance for revenge. But while the Foreign Secretary was at the United Nations, Anthony Nutting, the Minister of State, was with the Prime Minister at his country residence, Chequers. Here, a French mission arrived with an audacious plan. Israel should attack Egypt across the canal. France back them up, repossess the canal, and topple Nasser. But they needed one more essential ingredient.
The only snag, of course, was that the French did not have bomber bases anywhere near enough to take care of Nasser's air force. Only the British did. So the British had to be brought into the conspiracy with France and Israel. And at that moment you could see the whole cloud had disappeared for Anthony Eden. This was the opportunity to put into effect his declaration of war on Nasser, because Nasser had refused to give him any pretext, even after the nationalization of the company. But with the Israelis marching on the canal, he could say the canal is going to be irreparably damaged by warfare. We must intervene and put out the fire. We must intervene and stop the war.
The plan was put into operation. Israel invaded on the 29th of October. On the 30th, Britain and France issued an ultimatum, demanding both Egypt and Israel withdraw 10 miles from the canal, or they would invade. On the 31st, when the ultimatum expired, seaborne troops set out for the invasion, and, as arranged, Britain bombed Egyptian air bases.
Flown from aircraft carriers were hundreds of sorties attacking military targets near Port Said. This followed up heavy bombing raids which had already put Egyptian airfields out of service and all but destroyed Nasser's air force.
I've never known anything like it in my whole diplomatic career, and I've been to several hotspots. It was quite extraordinary. We had virtually all the United Nations against us, and it wasn't only in their resolutions. There was a sort of almost a personal atmosphere about it.
My government and the French government are accused of committing an act of aggression. This, Mr. President, is a very serious charge to make in the Security Council, bearing in mind the provisions of Chapter 7 of the Charter. We strongly deny such charges and do not think it will be profitable for the Council to discuss them.
We used to always have our drinks with the American delegation. We were close friends. At the time of Suez, about 2/3 of them wouldn't talk to us. And the one or two who did were rather brave. And we felt like pariahs, sort of, underdogs and outcasts.
I doubt that any delegate ever spoke from this forum with as heavy a heart as I have brought here tonight. We speak on a matter of vital importance, where the United States finds itself unable to agree with three nations with whom it has ties of deep friendship, of admiration and respect, and two of whom constitute our oldest, most trusted and reliable allies.
And of course we were meanwhile lying through our teeth to the American ambassador in London and saying that we had no knowledge of any Israeli intention to attack Egypt. And when the Israelis did attack and we drew up the famous ultimatum telling everybody to clear out of the Canal zone, Egyptians and Israelis, we again lied to the American ambassador and said that this was the first intimation we'd ever had of any Israeli intention to march into march onto Egyptian soil.
Anthony Nutting and two other ministers resigned, but gave no reasons. So the demonstrators protesting throughout Britain did not know the full facts. Eden's conspiracy with France and Israel, his deception of Parliament, country, and allies. In his television broadcast to the nation, Eden relied on this ignorance. He tried to stop the leader of the opposition from making a televised reply, but the BBC judged the nation so divided that it had to overrule the Prime Minister.
What should we do? We put the matter to the Security Council. Should we have left it at that? Should we have been content to wait to see whether they would act? How long would this have taken?
The Council had met, reached a clear decision, and been blocked by the Prime Minister's own veto. There was no lack of speed here. The trouble was obstruction. Obstruction by Great Britain.
What we did do was to take police action at once. Action to end the fighting and to separate the armies. We acted swiftly and reported to the Security Council, and I believe that before long it'll become apparent to everybody that we acted rightly and wisely.
It is not a police action. There is no law behind it. We have taken the law into our own hands. The Prime Minister has said we were going in to separate the two sides. But you don't separate two armies by bombing airfields and landing troops 100 miles behind one side only. No, this is a second onslaught on a country which was already the victim of an attack.
At Portside Harbour and nearby, British troops came ashore. They were consolidating the work already done by paratroops and marine commandos in occupying this famous town at the north end of the Suez Canal. The capture of Portside was more difficult than was expected. Fires were still burning, result of house-to-house fighting, which General Keighley has described as very tough. But as the reinforcements came in, the battle was over. Happily, at surprisingly little cost, just over 100 killed and wounded.
It was not the condemnation of the world, but lack of money that pulled Eden up short. The day British troops had landed at Port Said, the pound sterling collapsed.
Eisenhower was very serious about this issue, and he was determined that he was going to bring it to a stop. So when the run on sterling began and the British turned to him to try to bail him out, his answer was, quit and I will. And I think he simply didn't have any intention of temporizing with it. He wanted it stopped, and that being the case, he was prepared to take whatever steps he could to bring it to an end.
The British Empire had discovered the limits of its power. Eden had no choice but to withdraw.
Before leaving, the troops leave a reminder of their 7-week occupation, a huge Union Jack nailed to a 180-foot flagstaff. This was made into a greasy pole to delay would-be climbers following the departure.
2 months after the invasion, Anthony Eden resigned as Prime Minister. He had been a sick man for many months.
Now, can I just say, thank you very much for all your kindness to me, all of you, during my period of office. I wish my successor all good fortune and Godspeed to you all. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
We'd been architects of the UN. We were founders of an organization to keep the peace, not through force, but through negotiations and peaceful methods. And here we were, having to take an entirely different role. I thought we'd never hold our heads up again. Point of fact, within 6 months we did. But at that time, this was the end of empire for us. It was like Gotterdämmerung, if you like, in a Wagnerian sense. And I don't want to go through that again.
You know, after Suez, Nasser became a hero. It changed him completely from being a ruler or a potential leader or a leader, and it made him a hero. And the effects, as a matter of fact, in Africa, the winds of change in Africa started after Suez.
On the one occasion they met, Eden had talked down to Nasser. Eden, then, was confident of his position. After Suez, it was Nasser who had the confidence. Britain's imperial standing had taken a knock from which it would never recover.
When the British Empire had agreed to give independence to all its principal colonies in Asia and Africa, Aden had other ideas, as you'll see when End of Empire continues next Sunday at 8:20. Stay with us now for a benefit gala to honor the celebrated bass baritone George London, recorded in Vienna and simulcast with ABC FM.